Today we have with us Kim Goodwin, who is the author of one of the first books I read about UX design, designing for the digital age. And I think I'm not alone to have had this book on my reading list when you study informatics or UX design, at least here in Sweden. And I remember as I was reading the book, this was more than 10 years ago, all my professors were saying that, well, this is all very good, but you also need to learn at least some programming and at least some graphic design as well, because in Sweden, the role of UX is not like sufficiently known out there. So nobody will actually hire you as a UX designer. And just during the 3 years I did my bachelor, I remember that changed a lot. And today the field looks quite different. But Kim is not only an author, she also has more than 20 years of experience within the business, designing products and services, both for small startups as well as big corporations. So I really wanted to take the opportunity today to speak a little bit about the history of the role of UX and how the role has basically changed very quickly during these last 20 years. And what better person to talk to than Kim Goodwin. So welcome, Kim Goodwin. Let's see if we can get your audio working as well. Yes.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, nice to see you. I have to start by asking, like, where are you? Because I know from your Instagram that you might actually be on Greenland as well as.
No, I'm at home. I live near the wine country in coastal California. So,
all right, fine, good. So, as I just said, I was hoping that we can have this conversation a little bit about the history of UX and the role of UX, which might be a bit of a big topic for 45 minutes. But I really wanted to take the opportunity, as you are one of the first people to form my idea of what is UX and why do we need it. So I remember when I read your book, as I said, like, I think it's 10 years ago right now, and that, I mean, it wasn't in Sweden, UX was still like such a new role, but just like very quickly, within a couple of years, like now UX is one of the most requested roles actually within our industry here in Sweden, and it has changed quite a lot. But I wonder, how was it when you wrote the book, 2009? Like, what was the climate like?
I think at that point, what we had originally been calling interaction design in the US was definitely getting adopted much more. I think we were starting to see more companies set up their own teams internally. I would say that, in the early days in the 90s, so much of it was, really so much of what was influencing the industry was coming out of consulting. And so, you definitely saw a lot of methods that were geared toward deliverables and things like that you could do on a statement of work, and not necessarily the sort of incremental progress that you really make inside of an organization. So I would say that consulting was still very influential, where now I think the influence has shifted much more in-house, and many more companies have large influential teams inside of organizations. I think a lot has changed. I think the emphasis of the role has changed. I think what UX even is an interesting question, because I think we really started out with some sort of overarching user experience role in mind. I think we made a bit more of a distinction between certain skill sets back in the 90s when things were just sort of gearing up in the industry.
But yeah, do you feel that, like, as you wrote the book, for example, did you come from a programming background, or from a graphical background, or from an organizational business background, or what was your kind of?
I came to it more from the visual side of things, but I think at the time, when I was running the consultancy at Cooper, we had a lot of folks who did come from a programming background. And I think that was true in the early days of interaction design, right? You had a lot of folks who came from programming or from, more of an information architecture background. And there was a little bit less emphasis on visual at the time. I think anybody who was considered a UX designer at the time, although we tended to use interaction design as a label more, tended to be pretty good at IA and, object-oriented thinking and that sort of thing, and often pretty terrible at visual design. So there were a lot of designers who were producing really excellent workflows and structures and object models and hideous visual design. So, we tended to treat visual design as a separate skill set at the time, overlapping certainly, but not always the same skills that you would find in the same people.
And I remember, just once again referencing back to your book, and also like myself when I got educated within the field, how it was such a big emphasis on research and making quite also elaborate personas and elaborate documentation around this, which is something that I, from my perspective, feel that it has changed a little bit, but I would like to hear your comment on it, because
sure,
your experience.
Yeah, I think that, because so much of the discussion of method at the time was driven by folks who had really come up in consultancies, and in a consultancy, you tend to be a little bit deliverable focused, right? Because that's what your contract says. Yeah. And so I think there was definitely an emphasis on polished deliverables as opposed to useful artifacts that can help a team move along. So there was less of the kind of, hey, collaborate across the team and show your work in progress and let people see the sausage making, as we say in the US, and a little bit more, show them your perfect polished thinking, which, in an in-house team is often less useful. I do think that, with personas in particular, personas are really useful tools and they're badly misunderstood. But I think even, around 2000 or so, there were firms that were spending just gobs of money on creating ridiculous personas. There was even one agency that was setting up persona living rooms inside of their clients' offices, and wow, that's a lot of money you're charging your clients for zero value. So, I think the research that goes into personas and the sort of behavioral shorthand that they're meant to be is really useful. And I think that some teams still are finding value in that. I think others are maybe misunderstanding what is useful about that particular tool. But yeah, I agree with you. I think there's less emphasis on fancy deliverables and much more on showing our work as we go and creating value as we go, which I think is definitely the better approach.
And going back to personas and this living room example, actually, what I'm wondering or thinking somehow is and I don't know because I wasn't there 20 years ago as you were, but how we might have come from a climate where the user was so outside of the process that we might have needed to go through this kind of other side of the problem where you're getting too much into the putting emphasis on the persona, and now we are in this middle land in the end, but maybe we haven't gotten here if it weren't for the living rooms or this kind of well,
I think the living rooms were a silly detour.
Yeah,
I was never a fan of, anytime I saw people doing really, really elaborate things with personas, I kind of shook my head because I think it's a waste of your time. The most important thing about the personas is the shared understanding of user goals and behavior patterns, right? And I don't think the utility of that has disappeared at all. I think it's still very common, I see, for teams to be unclear about which user they're talking about and not optimizing for anyone or trying to design for everyone and ending up not serving anyone. So, the useful forcing function of personas is clarity in the conversation. Well, which user are we talking about right now, right? Users need this is broadly never true, right? Not all users need a specific thing generally. So, which kind of user are we talking about in which situation? And so, leaning heavily on scenarios and to a lesser extent personas, I think is very clarifying in conversation for a team. Likewise, which persona are we focused on serving right now? Which kind of user need are we focused on? And I mean, you can argue whether you can do that with just scenarios without personas, sure. But, you've got to have someone who's in the scenario, right? Who feels like a real human. Even if you're just referring to a specific individual that you interviewed within your scenario, that can work too, right? You don't have to do an artificial construct, but having someone specific in mind, I think it's still really valuable to teams.
Yeah, what I see right now is that we're drifting a lot towards more of a focus on jobs to be done, kind of a where it's not so clear who's gonna do the job. And sometimes I can even discover myself doing this kind of thing where the user becomes somebody distanced. And then I realize a lot of times as I'm designing services that might be, like a parking app or something that I might end up using myself in the end of the day, that we like sometimes the user becomes somebody else instead of actually a human being. It just becomes these kind of jobs to be done. And I think it's a hard thing to find a balance.
Yeah, and I think that's where having a particular kind of person in mind, right? Personas are just a shorthand in the team. Doing a bunch of elaborate personas that aren't based on user research is not really a great use of your time, right? Spending time in the field with your users is the most important thing. But then the personas are just a shorthand for all the stuff you learned in research. And anybody who says, "Oh, well, personas don't accomplish this or that," you need the jobs to be done or whatever. Well, right. Personas were never meant to be used without scenarios. Right. I've joked once or twice that if you have just personas and you're not using scenarios, they're just sitting around and drinking all your wine and not accomplishing much for you. They're not going to work very hard if you don't put them in a scenario. Right. So if you have a particular kind of user who has particular complexities in a situation that maybe some other types of users don't encounter, well, you want to take a look at that. So, I mean, even just something like air travel, right? As someone who travels a lot, I'm going to experience a problem with my travel differently from, say, someone who's only traveled 3 or 4 times in their lives, right? I have knowledge of how the systems work. I know where to go to get help, right? I'm not going to need the same kind of support that somebody who's, wait, my flight is delayed. What do I do? Right. So I think you just have to think through what knowledge does that person have? What goals do they have? What's at their disposal? And making sure you've got that range of users covered is really helpful. Yeah.
I know we spoke a little bit beforehand about this conversation, and something you mentioned was like what you felt had changed is also like what we're designing and who is designing a little bit before us in comparison to now. And
sure.
What's your view on that?
Well, let's start with who is designing. I think that, I can't speak for how things have evolved in Sweden so much, but I think in the US, if you went to a design conference in, say, 1995, there were a few of them then, not nearly so many as there are now. It was pretty much old white guys on the stage, right? It was folks of a particular era. It was people of a particular demographic. I was very commonly the only woman speaking at an event. And that was the industry, that's not to say that other people weren't there, but other people's voices were not really heard so widely in the industry. And I think that has changed tremendously for the better. I think, the folks who are designing products are starting to look a lot more like the folks who use the products and the services. And, I think we still have challenges in the industry with, whose voices are influential and whose need to be amplified. But it's changed quite a bit. I see some folks who also sort of came up in my era, if you will, grumbling about the state of design, kind of kids today, don't know this or that. And it just makes me want to pull my hair out, honestly, because people act as if there was some sort of golden age of design that we're somehow not in anymore. And this was just never true.
No.
I think that people have always come into design with sort of a patchwork of experiences from different fields. And I think that we have a lot of room to grow still, but I think we have gotten much better at understanding we're not just designing for that user, but for all the impacts around that user, right? And that design isn't just about being user-centered, it's about looking at the society and what happens when you automate this, and what happens, whose jobs are affected, and how is the environment affected. And I don't think these things were so much in the consciousness, 20, 30 years ago at all. No. So I think all of those things are, as far as I'm concerned, huge improvements.
It's an interesting point of view, because I thought you were speaking about rather the different roles that we're taking into the design conversations when you said who is designing, but that's another perspective that you're presenting right there. Because I feel
I think the roles have evolved a bit too. I think these days there's definitely a UX designer role that is not necessarily well defined, right? And I think there's a lot of skill sets under what we think of as the UX umbrella, right? Because the user experience encompasses content and visual and flow and service and a whole bunch of things, right? So I think there's a lot of emphasis on visual design to an extent that there wasn't in, say, the 90s or early 2000s. That was a weakness at the time. I think a lot more people are getting into the industry now without necessarily strong skill sets in understanding information architecture or sort of an object-oriented model, right? Like I see a lot of folks who don't engage with the data model. And I think, how are you even thinking through the workflow without understanding, that person's mental model of the objects and how that's instantiated in the data? And that's a huge part of the usability. But, people had different weaknesses 20, 30 years ago. So it's always a matter of building a team from a variety of different backgrounds and skill sets, right? Because individuals are never going to have all of the skills. So, I think the idea that somehow design is worse off today just drives me a little nuts. It's shifted a bit, and so we need to adapt how we build our teams, and we maybe need to coach people in different things than we used to.
Yeah, and I feel a little bit like, it depends a little bit on in which team you are, but I definitely been both in teams where like, as a UX designer, I've been seen like some kind of expert that's supposed to come with all the solutions. Whereas in other teams, you're more viewed as the kind of design coach almost to make design a team effort. I'm not really sure if we have a kind of 50-50 field or if we're drifting more towards the team effort, but I feel that is a little bit what's happening. It might also explain why some old designers are talking about the golden era of design when, designer was the expert, everybody listened, and now it's supposed to be a team effort and it's something else.
I think it's, well, yes and no. I think that's partly a cultural thing. And an organizational cultural thing, right? So you will definitely see some organizations where there's still an expectation that designers bring expertise to the table and drive the design. And there are other organizations where there's much more value on democratization of it. And neither of those is the right answer everywhere, right? The way that you influence people to make better design decisions in an organization depends on that organization's culture. There's not a right answer here. I do think that I think the one challenge we have with democratization is whether you're talking about design or user research, because I think it comes up in both, is there's absolutely a benefit to having lots of people involved. And yet expertise is still an actual thing, right? And so, let's not go out and pretend that everyone can go out and do an equally effective user interview. Let's not pretend that everyone has an equal amount of knowledge in doing design, because it's not the case, right? Right. We don't say that about engineering, right? We don't say that about pretty much any other discipline. We don't tend to assume everyone can do it. At the same time, we don't want to be gatekeepers, right? So I think it's an interesting balance that we have to strike. Like, we want to lead a team and bring a team along with us in doing our design or our research. And yet, if you've been doing user research for 20, 30 years, you know a lot of things that person who's just doing their 6th user interview doesn't know.
Totally.
We need to make sure that we're creating space for people, and also leaving room for ourselves to lead where we have the expertise to lead.
This leads me into another question that I've been thinking about, which, 20 years ago or even 15 years ago, there wasn't so much standards within, now I'm speaking mostly about digital design maybe, but now 10 years later, like, we have certain standard interfaces for apps and websites and web applications, in the sense like the logo goes there, the menu goes there, this is what you're expecting to find in the footer and so on. And this is also like a balance that I think is a little bit interesting to hear your comment on, like, when should we kind of rely on standards, and when are we in the risk of, like, stagnating design in a sense, like, and what is your kind of observation when you see how it's developing right now?
Well, it's another one of those it depends answers, right? I think I would say we probably have patterns more so than standards exactly, but where people are very used to a certain interaction idiom, you want to leave that alone unless you have a good reason to change it, right? So, if people are used to finding contact us in the footer of our web page or something, leave it there unless you have evidence that you've got a better solution. Don't just mess with it to mess with it. But I do think that it's also important that we not just assume because something is popular that it's good, which is an assumption I see getting made a lot, right? Like, carousels on websites are popular doesn't mean they're good. And just because Apple does something doesn't mean that's the right answer from a usability point of view, right? So there are definitely things that are fads that perform much less well from a human interaction point of view, and maybe they look cooler or they feel a little bit more modern, but they cause different problems for users. So, I just think we have to apply critical thinking to when we call something a standard, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. But you brought up the fact that we're designing different things today than we were. I think that's actually been a very large shift in the industry. In the early 90s, I would say much of the design was desktop applications, right? Lots of productivity tools, some games and things like that too. But for the most part, as a designer, your job was to figure out, how do I make this person's life easier? How do I make their tasks more efficient? How do I just make this interaction feel better? Because, if they love the software, they'll pay to upgrade, right? So the business model was really different. It was all about creating value directly for the user most of the time. Now, in enterprise software, sometimes you were still streamlining a process in a way that maybe had a negative impact on somebody's job, but it was mostly, well, how do I free up the stupid stuff this person does so that they can do the part of their job that actually takes their creative thinking? And then I think, e-commerce started to get more popular, and you started to look a bit more at, well, how do I increase conversion rates, right? How do I get somebody to put that thing in their shopping cart and actually finish that transaction, right? And then the ad model started creeping in, and all of a sudden it was, how do we get people to click things, and how do we get people to share their data and monetize their interaction? And so I think there started to be a lot more privacy concerns, a lot more ethics concerns with what kind of influence is okay and not okay. A lot more potential conflicts between the user interests and the interests of the folks who were ultimately the customer. And so I think that all has gotten quite a bit more complicated. And it's not to say those things didn't exist. but we're not nearly this complex 30 years ago. There's definitely a lot more for us to think about as designers, and we really have to be, I think, to some extent, ethicists and privacy experts. And if no one else in the team is saying, well, should we really collect that piece of sensitive data? Do we really need it? We as designers, I think, need to be asking those questions. As folks who are coming from the point of view of that user. Hopefully the whole team is doing that, right? We don't own that territory, but I would say that if that isn't naturally happening in the team, it's definitely up to us to make sure that it's happening. So yeah, I think that what we're designing has changed the skill sets we need. I think we're much more focused on things like engagement and persuasion than we were. And I think we have to be cautious about that too.
And I'm also thinking about, we've been in a wave where everything is just like, we're digitalizing everything that we can, which we, ended up like people being quite frustrated also about the fact when you want to contact customer support, it's just another chatbot. And I know a lot of my colleagues were frustrated about like not being, sufficiently early in the design process, actually to be able to say that, maybe money should go to more customer support rather than to another digital solution, so to say. And do you see like any opportunity for the UX role to come a little bit higher up in the design hierarchy, or like for companies to start understanding that maybe it's not always like the next digital solution that we need to implement, but rather start designing physical flows as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to customer support, that's a great example. Sometimes the chatbot is a reasonable answer, right? And I think that, as designers, we can't always go to, well, this would be the best user experience, therefore it's the best answer, because that's not always true, right? Sometimes it's okay to trade a bit of user experience for operational efficiency or other reasons, right? And it partly depends on who you're serving and in what context and what kind of brand you have, right? If you're a luxury brand, you're not going to send people to a chatbot. You're going to let them talk to a human, right? So I think that different brands have different value propositions, right? If you're a government agency and you have to be accessible to everyone, regardless of how profitable they are or not, you're going to make different decisions than you would as a business. So, I think as designers, we have to keep in mind that we need a global perspective where, yes, we want to put the interests of the user and the society in front of everyone, but we also need to keep in mind that there's a lot of considerations that go into business decisions, right? So I think, wearing our business hats is a good way to make sure that we don't get shut out of those early conversations. I think being able to speak that language of business and talk about things like brand equity and talk about things like operations and being able to read a balance sheet and understanding how venture capital works and all of those things help us have those discussions, right? If we're just focused on, but this is a better user experience, people are going to invite us to the next meeting.
Yeah, which takes me a little bit to the last part, like where I would like us to just focus a little bit towards the future and like to have a look at like what kind of skill set should a future UX designer focus on getting. I mean, I started off saying like when I was at university, my professors told me, well, you better learn programming and graphic design because nobody's going to hire you for interviewing users. Whereas today I can see that it's actually one of the things that we get asked for a lot, like this kind of profession of actually knowing how to conduct research, And if we look a little bit into the future, what would you imagine is a important skill set for the next generation?
I wish I knew. I don't think any of us can really predict that. I think there's a few interesting things though. Certainly prototyping is always valuable. User research, it's exciting to see how much more value that is than it once was. I think some of those skills are just going to be evergreen. I think a lot of folks focus on learning, getting to know specific platforms or technologies in a way that those are always going to change, right? You don't necessarily go to school to learn how to use Figma or to learn how to design for iOS, because those things are going to change. There's going to be new tools. There's going to be new new operating systems that we're designing for. So I think really the fundamentals are, how do you influence stakeholders? How do you get to know humans? How do you translate that into, scalable designs, implementable designs that accomplish the business need as well as the human need? Those are always going to be the fundamentals. I think as far as stuff that's interesting, how do we integrate things like large language models and image generation and stuff like that? Like, yeah, we're in the hype cycle on that stuff right now. But bits and pieces of that will be incorporated into our work increasingly. So how do you constrain a chatbot so that it doesn't do what Microsoft Bing is doing these days? And I don't know if you saw the article where a journalist had a lengthy conversation with Microsoft Bing, which is based on the OpenAI technology. And the chatbot was trying to convince the journalist that he was unhappy in his marriage and should just love the chatbot. Like, so how do you constrain a chatbot so that this doesn't happen? Because obviously this is the technology going off the rails, but there are useful bits in that technology that we absolutely can use to make interactions better. But we have to understand what it's good at and what it's not. Yeah. Anyway, I don't think that's a great answer, but that's my best guess for you.
No, but it's interesting. I think, you touched a little bit upon also like the field of AI, which is also like something that I wanted to ask you about. I just read one of my former colleagues, Ponter Vanestol, wrote a book called Designing for AI, I think in English, which argues that AI is basically this new design material that we need to learn as designers. And I wonder, have you yourself worked with designing something for AI yet? Or
yeah, I have a bit, and it's interesting because it's AI is another one of those things. It's like UX; it means like 17 different things.
Yeah, I know. It's true.
There's image generation, there's the large language models, there's there's all sorts of things. I think that a lot of what we call AI, frankly, is just just rule sets behind the scenes. But when it comes to something like a large language model, where you can't actually predict exactly what it's going to say, you can't completely script that user experience. It's a little bit like what it reminds me of is ages ago, we used to know pretty clearly what resolutions we would have on a screen, right? And so we could design a window to be a certain size and only ever that size. And then when we started getting these flexible viewports on the web, like your screen could be this wide or it could be this wide, we don't really know. And designers sort of had to make that mental shift between I can control the pixels to I can only kind of sort of control the layout. Right. And I think that if you're designing with something like a large language model, you can't control every word anymore. But you can still control workflow, and you can still, through how you engineer prompts and so on, you can still create a structured experience. It just won't be controlled to the same extent. And it seems to me like it's a similar sort of mental shift, right? To understand how do we make that experience, how do we make that container work when we can't control the contents.
Yeah, and I mean, you spoke a little bit about ethics before, and I think something that goes up and down a little bit how much we speak about it, and I think can also see that there's different designers with different opinions here. Like, I know some of my colleagues feel like, I mean, as a UX designer, you will not change the world, or it's not upon your shoulders. But I also have a lot of colleagues that are quite passionate actually, and came into the business because they wanted to change the world. And so I think like ethics, as I see it, is something that's definitely going to be or should be part of the skill set for any new UX designer or service designer, and especially when it comes to AI, as we're starting to maybe become the only advocates in the team that might carry this kind of responsibility or knowledge. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we never assume that we're the only ones who have users' interests in mind, right? I think that believing that being designers somehow makes us uniquely user-centered is probably a bit arrogant. Yes, I do agree that we need to make sure, if nobody else is doing it, that we're certainly doing it. And yeah, I do think some understanding of ethics is an important core skill set in any design profession, really. But I think especially when we're touching so many aspects of people's lives, it's essential. And, you know, I don't think we're going to, as designers, like, I don't feel like I, as an individual, am ever going to, I don't know, overturn capitalism or something, right? I'm not going to reinvent the world in that way. I kind of look at it as, can my work make life better for some people without making it worse for other people? Like, at the end of the day, if I do that, that's what I'm here for, right? So, and I think that's what design is all about, is making life better for some without making it worse for others. And I think there was a time when we focused on making it better for some and not really thinking about the others. And were we making it worse for other people? I think we've matured as an industry to the point that at least we are thinking about that now. Maybe not as broadly or as consistently as we want to, but the conversation's happening, which is a good start.
And when we're talking about being more inclusive or designing more for like more people, and maybe also with the ecological system in mind, and so, like, could you give an example or some idea of how that actually takes like an expression in the practical work that we're doing?
Sure. Well, some of it is just about how you prioritize the use cases that you design for. Some of it is just about what are the questions you raise in the conversation. So, you know, it could be as simple as, actually a lot of it comes down to product management, which I think, you know, designers need to be good at thinking through things in this way. I had a client that was, the design team had pushed for a way to search for other users based on multiple non-binary genders. And product manager was looking at the metrics and said, oh, you know, only about 3 or 4% of people are using this feature, so we should get rid of it. I don't want to maintain it anymore. And so the conversation was about, okay, well, yes, it's not particularly helping a huge range of people, but it's actually very important for the people who need it. Right, to see that they are welcome here, right? And what happens if this field goes away? What's the impact on those people? And you know, can we call on some user research to help people see the negative impact of being invisible in these spaces? And the product manager said, you're right. Okay, I get it. We'll leave the feature alone, right? So it can be as simple as that sort of thing, right? Where it's about I feel like so often in product management and design these days, our conversation turns to metrics. And so, you know, data-driven decisions, and we can't just be all about the hard numbers. We also have to look at what's the human impact. Who are the people represented by the numbers? And we need to bring that storytelling into our work, which qualitative research is particularly good for. And I think we also need to be good at quantifying where we are doing harm, right? So, you know, can we find ways to measure what it feels like to be excluded from a platform? You know, can we find ways to ask people what the negative impact on their experience is? Because sometimes if we can start to quantify those things, it gets attention, you know, that the qualitative stuff doesn't. So you sort of have to look at what sort of data do people in that organization believe and figure out how can I translate the human needs into that kind of data that they will accept and understand. So sometimes it's as simple as that. Other times it's, you know, it's about persuading someone to prioritize a use case that they might not otherwise, because there's potential for harm there. Anyway, I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. It answers, but I'm not sure I agree that it's easier to quantify some of these things, though. But
it's not easy to quantify,
no.
but I do think that we can start to make an effort to quantify them. For example, let's say in the case I was just using, right?
Yeah.
Let's say that we have versions of the service with the inclusive gender field and without. Why don't we ask people how welcome and included they feel? And why don't we look at what's the abandonment rate of the platform by demographic, right? Why don't we look at those kinds of things? And then we'll start to see, there is a disparate impact here, so that we can make that case that it's not just, we heard this in a user interview and we think it could be a good idea. Ideally, that is enough in a values-driven organization to make that case.
Yeah.
But when it's not, we can start to look at, how is it different by demographic and help people see how, what are the other ways that might be doing harm.
Now I get you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So sometimes just putting it in a survey instead of a user interview gets people to believe it.
Yeah.
I don't think surveys are the place to start most of the time. I'm very much a fan of the richness we can get with the qualitative data. But surveys can be actually good for making arguments if they're well crafted and based on what you learn in the qualitative data.
Yeah, they speak with numbers, and some people prefer numbers. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd rather make the argument in the way that's going to win the argument.
Yeah.
Rather than say, but you should value the qualitative data. Well, okay, fine. If you don't, let's figure out a way to quantify it.
Yeah. I would love to speak for another hour, but I know we're running out of time already. But just to wrap up, what will you speak about at the conference, the 12th of May?
Let's see. I am talking about some lessons that designers can learn from healthcare, which is a field I have done a lot of work in the last several decades. I think we have a lot to learn from healthcare, actually, about making the case for better design. So I'll talk about some lessons learned from that. And then I'm also doing a workshop that's a deep dive on things like personas and scenarios that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. So,
all right, great.
How to and we'll sort of cover in the workshop, we'll cover a range of things from, how to make sure you're getting the right stuff out of your user interviews to help you make those decisions down the road. And then how we can use things like journey maps and scenarios to really guide both the conceptual design all the way down to actually even things like visual hierarchy decisions. So it's a pretty hands-on class, and it's about really stringing all those methods together.
Oh, okay, great. That's interesting. Well, thank you so much, Kim. It was great talking to you.
Stockholm.
Yeah, looking forward to meeting you in real life.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.